Chuck Norris was laughing. The audience was laughing. They were laughing at a joke about Dean Martin's mother. Chuck did not know. Dean's mother had been dead for 2 years. Chuck did not know Dean was watching, backstage, on a monitor, 6 seconds. That was all the time Chuck had left before Dean Martin did something. Something that had never been done on The Tonight Show. Not in 14 years. Not once. What Dean did in 6 seconds stopped the show, stopped Chuck Norris, and taught a lesson that Chuck would carry for the rest of his life. The studio that night looked the way it always looked. 200 seats, a band, a desk, Johnny Carson's chair, which had become the most famous chair in American television by the midpoint of his run. The set was comfortable in the way that things become comfortable when they are part of a nightly ritual. America had been watching this exact configuration for years. The camera angles were familiar. The rhythm was familiar. The sense that whatever happened on this stage was managed and contained and would resolve pleasantly was as familiar as anything on television. Nothing about that night looked different from the outside. Not yet. Angela Crocetti died in 1974, 2 years before that night. Dean rarely spoke about her in interviews. He did not bring her up on talk shows. He did not reference her in profiles. The loss was private, the kind of private that does not look for an audience. Angela was an Italian immigrant who had worked her whole life. She had raised her children with the kind of strength that does not announce itself, the kind that simply shows up every day and does what needs to be done. She had come from Montesilvano, a small town in central Italy. She had crossed an ocean. She had settled in Steubenville, Ohio, in a neighborhood of other Italian immigrant families who understood the particular arithmetic of starting over in a new country. She raised her children in that neighborhood. She cooked. She worked. She held things together with the kind of consistency that is invisible until it is gone. Dean grew up watching her do all of this. Before the nightclubs and the records and the movies. Before any of it. He watched her navigate a world that had not made room for her and make room for herself anyway. That shaped something in him. Not the performing Dean Martin, the person underneath the performer. The part that knew where it came from and never forgot. The distance between Dino Crocetti and Dean Martin was not just a name change. It was a journey, and at the beginning of that journey was a woman in Steubenville who worked hard and asked for nothing and gave everything she had to the people who needed it. When Dean stood on stages and audiences applauded, Angela was part of what they were applauding, even if they did not know her name, even if they never would. For Dean, she was the foundation, the person before all the names and the stages and the records. She was the beginning, and she was gone. 2 years is not long. 2 years is still fresh, still raw in the places where you do not expect it to hurt, still arriving without warning in quiet moments, a song, a smell, a joke someone makes on a talk show who does not know what they are saying and does not know who is listening. Chuck Norris did not know any of this. That matters. He was not cruel. He was not calculated. He was a man on a television show making a joke that he thought was harmless. That distinction matters. But it does not change what happened next. Chuck Norris in 1976 was a rising force. He had built his reputation in martial arts long before Hollywood noticed him. World middleweight karate champion, Korean War veteran, a man who had fought in real competition with real consequences. When he transitioned to film, he brought something the camera liked: physical certainty, the kind of presence that fills a screen without effort. He was on The Tonight Show that night promoting a new film. The conversation had been light. He demonstrated a technique for Johnny Carson, who laughed and stepped back. The audience loved it. Chuck was charming in the way that people who could genuinely hurt you sometimes are. The gap between the capability and the demeanor made it funny. Chuck was also genuinely likable. That was part of his appeal. He was not arrogant about what he could do. He was matter of fact about it. He had a self-deprecating quality that made audiences comfortable. He seemed like someone you could sit next to at a diner. He just happened to be able to take apart anyone in the room if required. That lightness was working for him on the show that night. The segment was going well. The audience was engaged. Johnny was having fun. Everything was working. The Tonight Show was the biggest platform in America that year. Johnny Carson had been hosting for 14 years. The format was precise. Every segment had timing. Every guest had a slot. Guests waited backstage in the green room. They came out when called. They sat in the chair. They did their segment. They moved over when the next guest came out. That was the format. That was how it worked. Always. Without exception. Dean Martin was the next guest that night. His segment was 10 minutes away. He was in the green room, watching on a monitor, sitting in a chair with whatever he had been holding before he set it down and stood up. But that was not the whole story, because none of the people in that studio knew what was happening 15 feet away. In the green room, at the moment Chuck's joke landed, Chuck Norris had just made a joke about Dean Martin's mother on live television. Chuck was laughing. The audience was laughing. Nobody knew that Dean's mother had died 2 years earlier. Nobody knew Dean was watching backstage. And nobody knew what was about to happen. Something that had never happened in Tonight Show history. Dean Martin was about to stop the show. We are building a channel about these moments. When someone crossed a line. When dignity mattered more than protocol. When one action taught a lesson that lasted a lifetime. We are at 400 subscribers, trying to reach 700. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. What Dean did in the next 6 seconds would stun everyone watching. The conversation had drifted naturally toward Dean. Johnny was good at this, transitioning between topics with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Chuck had been talking about the difference between action stars and entertainers. The way Hollywood categorized people. Tough guys in one box, performers in another. Chuck was in the first box. Dean was arriving for the second segment of the night. The segment had been going well for 40 minutes. Chuck was comfortable on camera. Some people freeze when the red light comes on. Others find it. Chuck found it. He leaned back in the chair the way people do when they have decided to enjoy themselves. He answered Johnny's questions with the directness of someone who did not spend a lot of time managing his image. The audience liked him, not just his reputation. Him, the way he talked. The way he laughed at himself when Johnny set him up. The way he answered questions about fighting with the matter of fact quality of a man describing a skill rather than a talent. He made martial arts seem like a language, one that took years to learn and could be spoken quietly. Johnny was enjoying himself. You could tell. He had a specific energy when he genuinely liked a guest. He leaned forward more. His questions got sharper. He was not filling time with Chuck. He was actually in the conversation. The band was quiet. The lights were warm. 200 people in those seats had no idea the night was about to change. Johnny mentioned Dean was coming up next. A setup, a transition. Chuck reached for humor. The contrast was right there. Action stars and entertainers. Tough versus smooth. Chuck in one world, Dean in another. It was an easy joke with an obvious shape. Chuck made the comparison. Something about Italian mothers. About how Dean Martin's mother was probably tougher than Dean. The logic was recognizable. Italian immigrant women are famously strong. Dean is famously relaxed. Therefore, a humorous comparison. The audience laughed. They heard an Italian cultural joke from a martial arts star. Completely harmless. The kind of thing you say and move on from in 3 seconds. Chuck smiled. Johnny chuckled. The segment was moving along perfectly. None of them knew. None of them knew that Angela Crocetti had been buried 2 years ago. That her son had stood at her funeral and held that grief the way he held everything private, completely inside, not visible, not shared. None of them knew that backstage, in a room with a monitor, Dean Martin had just heard his mother's name used as a punchline. Used. Without knowing her. Without knowing her name. Without knowing anything at all. Dean's face went still. Not angry, not yet. Something else. Something that sits underneath anger. Something colder and more certain. The expression of a person who has just heard something cross a line. A line they did not know could be crossed until it was crossed. He watched the monitor for a moment longer than one breath. Chuck still laughing on screen. Audience still laughing. Johnny moving on to the next question like nothing had happened. But it had not passed for Dean. The green room was quiet. There may have been other people in it. An assistant. A publicist. Someone with a schedule and a clipboard who was thinking about the next 10 minutes. None of them registered what had just changed in the room. Dean's face was not performing anything. It was simply still. The stillness of someone who has made a decision before they fully know they have made it. He set down what he was holding. He stood up. His segment was 10 minutes away. The stage manager had a clipboard with timing. Everything was on schedule. Everything was planned. Dean walked toward the stage. A crew member saw him moving. "Mr. Martin, your segment is not for another." Dean walked past him. The stage manager was positioned near the entrance to the stage. His job was to manage the flow of guests. He had been doing this for years. Nothing unusual happened on this show, nothing unplanned. That was the whole point. "Dean, wait, you can't." Dean kept walking. The show was still running. Chuck was still talking to Johnny. The cameras were on Chuck. The audience was watching Chuck. Nobody had announced Dean Martin. Nobody knew he was coming. The curtain was fabric and nothing else, and Dean's hand was on it. One breath. Then he walked through. What happened next had never happened in Tonight Show history. Not once in 14 years. Guests do not interrupt other guests. Not on The Tonight Show. Not in Johnny Carson's run. The format is sacred. The timing is precise. Everything is planned and prepared and cleared. The idea of a waiting guest simply walking onto the stage while another segment is live was not something anyone in that building had a protocol for. Because it did not happen until it did. Dean Martin stood on the Tonight Show stage in the middle of Chuck Norris's segment. Uninvited, unannounced. The audience saw him first. Confusion moved through the seats in a wave. That is not how this works. Dean is not announced yet. Why is Dean on stage? Is this part of the show? Is this a bit? It was not a bit. Johnny Carson's face went white. In 14 years hosting The Tonight Show, he had seen everything. He had seen guests break down. He had seen interviews go sideways. He had managed every situation with the grace of someone who had been trained by experience to stay smooth, no matter what. He had never seen this. A guest walking on during another guest's segment, breaking the format, breaking every rule of the show. Johnny Carson had no protocol for this, no prepared response, no practiced smile for this exact moment. He went white. The camera operators kept rolling. Nobody cut away. Nobody in the control room made a move toward commercial. Something was happening that none of their training had covered, and instinct said to stay on it. Chuck Norris stood up. Respect. It was Dean Martin, a legend. A man who had been making records in movies since before Chuck had his first fight. Chuck extended his hand. He thought this was friendly. He thought Dean was coming out early for a surprise. Something planned. Something fun. He was smiling. He was wrong. Dean walked straight to Chuck. He did not smile. He did not wave to the audience. He did not acknowledge Johnny. He walked. His face was calm, terrifyingly calm. The calm of someone who has already decided. Who is not calculating anymore. Who has moved past the moment of deciding into the moment of doing. Chuck's smile began to disappear. Dean stopped 3 feet from Chuck. He looked at him. 1 second. 2. The audience was completely silent. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was clapping. 200 people were holding their breath in unison. Dean Martin stood on the Tonight Show stage, in the middle of Chuck Norris's segment. Uninvited, unannounced, the audience silent. Johnny Carson frozen. Chuck Norris realizing something was very wrong. Dean was about to say something. 4 sentences. That would make Chuck Norris apologize on live television. That would teach a lesson Chuck would never forget. The moment is here. Dean said Chuck's name. Just that. 1 word, Chuck. But the way Dean said it was not a greeting. It was not friendly. It was the way you say someone's name when everything else you are about to say depends on them understanding that you are serious, that this is not performance, that this is real. Chuck's smile was gone. You just mentioned my mother, but not a question, a statement. Flat and certain and carrying something in it that the audience could feel without being able to name. Chuck opened his mouth, started to say something, an explanation. An apology beginning to form. Dean raised 1 finger. Pot. Silence. Dean spoke, not loud. He did not need loud. The room was so quiet that the monitors behind the cameras were audible. His voice was low and steady. Each sentence arrived separately. Each one had its own weight. My mother passed 2 years ago. Pause. The pause was not dramatic. It was functional. It gave the sentence room to land. You don't know her name? Another pause. You don't know anything about her? Bop. Another pause. In that pause, Chuck understood something. He understood that he had not just made a careless joke. He had reached into something that was not his to touch. A life he did not know. A woman he had never met. A grief that was still active in the person standing 3 feet away. And he had used it as a punchline, in front of millions of people. But you made a joke on national television. Chuck's face had gone white. The confidence that came from being able to break boards and defeat champions was not present. Physical training does not prepare you for this, for the specific weight of being told, quietly and without anger, that you have done something wrong, that you have hurt someone, that the hurt was real. Dean looked at Chuck for 5 seconds. The audience did not breathe for 5 seconds. That is a long time. Long enough for everything to become clear. Long enough for every person watching at home to understand exactly what had happened. A joke, a dead woman, a grieving son, and the gap between what Chuck thought he was doing and what he actually did. Then Dean spoke again. You're going to apologize. Not a question. Right now, on this show, to everyone watching, a fact stated calmly. The way you state something when there is no question about it. When the only remaining variable is how quickly it happens. Chuck Norris nodded. He turned toward the camera. The show was still running live. Millions of people watching across America. The camera operator, operating on instinct and years of experience, kept the shot steady. Nobody in the control room cut away. Nobody went to commercial. Something rare was happening, and everyone in that building understood it without being told. Chuck's voice shook. "I made a joke about Dean Martin's mother." He paused, the weight of what he was saying arriving as he said it. He had said things on camera hundreds of times. He had done interviews and demonstrations and promotional appearances. He had never said anything that cost him as much as these words. It was wrong, disrespectful, bah. Another pause. "Dean's mother passed away. I didn't know, but that's no excuse. I'm sorry to Dean. I'm sorry to anyone I offended." He looked at Dean. Dean nodded once. A single nod. Not forgiveness exactly, not warmth. Acknowledgement. The thing was done. The record was corrected. His mother's name had been used carelessly on national television, and now, on national television, the record showed it was wrong. That it had been wrong. That the man who said it understood it was wrong. That was what mattered. Dean walked to the guest chair. His chair. The one that had been waiting for him for the segment, that was still 10 minutes away on the original schedule. He sat down. He looked at Johnny. Johnny Carson, in 14 years, had never been more impressed by a guest. He had interviewed presidents and astronauts and artists who had defined their generation. He had never seen anything quite like what had just happened in front of him. He composed himself. He asked the first question of Dean's segment. The show continued. Johnny's voice was different, careful in a way it had not been before Dean walked through the curtain. He chose his words. He moved through the segment with the attention of someone who understood that the normal rules of conversation did not fully apply to this particular moment on this particular night. Dean answered questions. He was charming, professional, easy in the way that Dean Martin was always easy. He talked about whatever he had come on to talk about. He made Johnny laugh when the moment allowed for it. He did his segment exactly the way it was supposed to be done. The version of him the audience knew and loved. But the energy in that studio was not the same energy it had been before Dean walked through the curtain. Something had settled into the room. Something that was not uncomfortable, but was not light either. The weight of having witnessed something real. Something that did not belong to the category of entertainment. There was no applause after Chuck's apology. Nobody clapped. Not one person in that audience raised their hands. They understood instinctively that applause was wrong here, that the appropriate response to a man apologizing for a real thing was silence. Respect. Not a performance of support. Not enthusiasm, just quiet acknowledgement. 200 people in that studio had just witnessed something they did not have a category for. Something outside the normal range of things that happened on talk shows. They sat quiet through Dean's segment, attentive in a way that audiences rarely are, every word landing fully. Nothing was background noise. Chuck Norris left during the commercial break before Dean's segment formally began. He did not stay for the rest of the show. He had a choice and he made it. He went backstage. He found Dean in a corridor. Dean was adjusting his jacket, getting ready to walk back out for the cameras. Chuck stopped him. He said everything again. The private version. The version without cameras. Without the record being corrected for millions of viewers. Without an audience watching to see how it would go. Just two men in a hallway. One of them had done something wrong. He knew it now. He needed to say it again in a space that had nothing to do with television. Dean listened. He stood still, and he listened, and he let Chuck say what Chuck needed to say. He did not rush him. He did not make it easier by interrupting or by waving it off. He let the words land the way they needed to land. When Chuck was done, Dean looked at him, not warmly, not coldly, directly. "Some things you don't joke about, ever." But Chuck nodded. He understood. Not just the rule, the reason behind the rule. You do not joke about someone's mother. Not when she is gone. Not when her son is standing in front of you. Not when you do not know her name or her story, or what she meant to the person she raised. You do not use another person's loss as the material for a comparison. Even when you mean no harm, even when you did not know. The not knowing is not a defense. It is the lesson. Dean extended his hand. Chuck shook it. And then Chuck Norris walked out of that studio. Chuck Norris never mentioned Dean Martin again. Not in interviews, not on talk show appearances, not in profiles, not in any of the books or documentaries about his career, not once. For the rest of his career, the subject did not exist publicly. He had learned something in that hallway. He had learned it on that stage first, in front of everyone. But the hallway was where it settled, where it became the kind of thing you carry permanently. Some lessons are loud when they arrive and quiet forever after. This was that kind. Years later, Johnny Carson mentioned the incident. Not often. He was not a man who replayed his own show's history in interviews. He managed his legacy carefully. But when the subject came up, when someone asked about the most intense moments of his run, he included this one. He called it the night someone broke every rule of the show for the right reason. He said Dean Martin walked on that stage and changed the temperature of the entire building. That every person in the studio felt something shift. That the shift did not go away for the rest of the night. That it lingered the way certain moments do when everyone present understands they have witnessed something that will not be repeated. The audience members from that taping remembered it the same way. Decades later, the way you remember things that do not fit into the normal category of memories. The kind of moment that stays sharp while other memories go soft. They had been there when Dean Martin walked through a curtain he was not supposed to walk through. When he stood in front of Chuck Norris and said 4 sentences that changed everything. When Chuck Norris stood at that microphone with a shaking voice and apologized. When the room went so quiet you could hear people breathing. Nobody who was there forgot it. This is not a story about a joke gone wrong. It is a story about what happens when someone crosses a line they do not know exists. A line that is invisible to people who have not lost what Dean had lost. Angela Crocetti was not a public figure. She was not a name that appeared in profiles of her son. She was private, going, and her son carried that loss the way he carried everything that mattered to him. Inside. Not for display, not for discussion, just there, every day. When Chuck made that joke, the line did not just exist in Dean's head. It existed in the real world, in the fact of Angela Crocetti's life and death, in the specific weight of 2 years of grief that had not yet fully settled, in the gap between the laughing audience and the man in the green room watching a monitor with a face that had gone completely still. Think about the people you have lost, the ones whose memory you carry, the ones who are gone in a way that you have not finished understanding yet. Now imagine someone making a joke about them, someone who never knew them, someone who uses them as a punchline without knowing their name or their life, or what they meant to the person sitting 15 feet away. You would understand exactly what Dean felt, exactly why he stood up, exactly why he walked through that curtain. There is a kind of pain that does not announce itself, that lives quietly inside the normal day, that most people around you cannot see because you have not shown it to them. And then something happens, something casual and unintentional from a person who genuinely does not know, and that quiet pain becomes something that requires a response. Not because the person who caused it was malicious, because some things cannot be let pass, not in silence, not on national television. Dean did not yell. He did not threaten. He did not use the violence that the moment might have excused from a different person. He stated facts. He made a demand. He received an apology. He sat down and did his interview. That is the full arc. From Chuck's casual joke to Dean's composed demand to Chuck's shaking voice on camera. The whole thing took minutes. It changed nothing about the past. It changed everything about the record. Real strength is not the loudest response. It is the most certain one. The kind that does not require volume because it does not require anyone to agree with it. Dean was not asking Chuck to understand. He was not asking the audience to validate him. He was not performing grief for sympathy. He was correcting a record. His mother's name had been used carelessly on national television. It would now be remembered that it was wrong. That was all. That was enough. The hardest thing is not the anger. The hardest thing is the calm. The ability to feel what Dean felt in that green room and walk through the curtain without letting the anger make the decisions. To arrive on that stage composed. To speak without raising your voice. To stop when you need to stop. To say exactly what is required and nothing more. And then to sit down and do your interview like a professional. Because the moment was handled. Because the record was corrected. Because sometimes that is enough. That is the strength that nobody talks about when they talk about strength. 1976. Chuck Norris made a joke about Dean Martin's mother on The Tonight Show. 6 seconds later, Dean Martin walked onto that stage, stopped the show, made Chuck apologize on live television, defended his mother's memory, did it with calm, with strength, with 4 sentences that Chuck Norris never forgot. If you want more stories about Dean Martin, the moments that showed who he really was, the quiet strength that changed lives, subscribe now. The playlist is waiting. These are the stories that matter. Chuck Norris was laughing. The audience was laughing. 6 seconds later, the room was silent. Dean Martin stood on that stage, uninvited, unannounced, breaking every rule. For the right reason. His mother had been dead for 2 years. Chuck did not know. But ignorance was not an excuse. Dean walked on. Dean spoke. Dean demanded an apology. Dean received it. On live television, in front of millions. Chuck Norris, martial arts champion and action star, apologized to a singer with a shaking voice because he had crossed a line. The one line you never cross. You do not joke about someone's mother. Not when she is gone. Not when her son is 15 feet away and the grief is 2 years old and has not finished settling. Dean Martin taught that lesson in 6 seconds. On The Tonight Show in 1976, he taught it without raising his voice, without threatening anyone, without a single word that was not necessary. 4 sentences, 1 demand, 1 nod when the apology came, and Chuck Norris carried that lesson for the rest of his life. In his silence on the subject, in the way he never again said Dean Martin's name in public. In the memory of a hallway conversation with a man who looked at him directly and said some things you do not joke about. Ever. Angela Crocetti raised a son who understood what she was worth. That son made sure the world understood it too. On one October night in 1976, on the biggest stage in America, with 6 seconds and 4 sentences, and a calm that was more powerful than anything else in that room.